welcome to the first session in the Friday morning. I am Shin Adachi of NTT CERT, the session chair for this presentation as well as the succeeding one. And as usual, it is my duty to give you some quick housekeeping notes and the warnings whether or not I like or you like. I just want to remind you to silence your noise generators, iPhones, phone, Android, PCs, whatever, to respect the other audience as well as our great presenter. And the TLP sign for this TLP for this presentation is clear, so least restrictive one. But I just wanna let you know. And after this session, please fill out the survey through your mobile phone. Your input is very, very much appreciated and very valuable. And today, on the first Friday morning, it is my great pleasure to introduce Lindsay Kaye. Please help me welcome her on stage.
All right. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about defending ESXi against ransomware attacks. So I'm Lindsay Kaye, and I'm the Senior Director of the Advanced Reversing Malware Operations and Reconnaissance Group at InSync Group at Record Future. So I run the technical part of our threat intelligence team, and by trade, I'm a malware analyst and reverse engineer. So ESXi really does present a very attractive target for threat actors, especially financially motivated ones who are looking to make money. It's for a variety of reasons. So first, a lot of organizations are moving their infrastructure towards virtualization. This means it's an increased number of potential victims for them. A lot of the things that they are moving to virtualization are key operational infrastructure, so not just kind of like your endpoint user systems, but stuff that really keeps the organization running. And it presents a lower technical barrier than Windows for the threat actors to victimize for a variety of reasons. So EDR and antivirus tools for ESXi are fairly nascent or not really existent. Third-party security tools are actually not recommended to be used on these systems. And trying to implement security measures is challenging. So when I mentioned that third-party tools are not recommended, this is from VMware's documentation. So they don't recommend using those on ESXi and really kind of focusing on the console operating system network instead. So when I mention security challenges, we think a lot about Windows, kind of the things that we go to implement our defenses there. But a lot of those really traditional detection tools don't actually translate to ESXi hypervisors in the same way. So if you think about it, signal rules looking at anomalies and logs. If you think about it, an adequately privileged actor can actually clear the logs of malicious indicators, so maybe not as useful there. Again, antivirus and EDR are nascent, so it's not just kind of the point and click compared to Windows. It's easy. And while some researchers talk about how you can implement Yara against ESXi, and it is feasible, it's somewhat clunkier and kind of less straightforward. Additionally, we talk a lot about patching. So vulnerabilities, you got to patch them. But if you think about ESXi systems, there's kind of a second layer of challenges that kind of come to us. So first, these things host kind of critical services and infrastructure. So any downtime could be particularly detrimental to the organization. You really don't want kind of your key infrastructure to be down. And there could be software interoperability issues. So if you think about things like legacy code or legacy programs, things like that that operate on a certain version, if you update it and they don't still work, then you have a giant headache to go fix. And finally, misconfiguration. I know misconfiguration is kind of a large issue, but now it can have sort of dire consequences because you're talking about now access to a lot of the organization's infrastructure as well. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of four kind of key areas of ESXi. Victimization by ransomware threat actors. So first, discovery initial access, so finding some victims and then getting access to them. So post-exploitation activity, so what are you doing to escalate and increase the impact of the attack? Many, but not all, actors will exfiltrate victim data. And then finally, the dropping of the actual ransomware. So today, for ESXi kind of specific parts of this kill chain, for discovery, I'll talk about open source discovery and network discovery. Initial access, so largely it's vulnerabilities and credentials. Post-exploitation activity, so there have been a couple backdoors against ESXi, and the use of some open source post-exploitation toolkits. And then we'll talk about some of the ransomware trends. So open source scanning is pretty easy to come by. So if you or me or any kind of threat actor wants to go, and they can use Shodan and Census for kind of seeing what systems are out there and what are they running. So very easily, you can identify things like geographical location, any services they're hosting that might suggest something that you might want to attack or might be vulnerable, open ports, any of the HTTP responses. So again, what are they running? Is anything vulnerable? And then finally, specific vulnerabilities on them. So very easy. Anybody can kind of point and click and do something like this. But also on network scanning. So let's pretend, for example, a threat actor has gained access to the organization and pretend they have done some sort of Active Directory enumeration, and now they want to figure out what else is on there that might be of interest. So they can do so with a variety of openly available tools, really kind of system administrator ones that almost anyone can get. So you can see an example, for example, of advanced IP scanner. So if you're on the network and then you're starting to kind of look around what a vSphere server might look like. So others include Nmap and SoftPerfect network scanner as well. So this makes it super easy to start identifying infrastructure based on the open ports, any file shares or service banners. So what else is there? What else might be of interest that they want to get access to? And then once they've done so, they need to now gain access, largely via credentials and exploitation. So you can get credentials from a variety of places. So for example, they're bought and sold on the dark web, often by initial access brokers, gained via information stealers. They could be in system administrator notes. They could be found in bash history when somebody accidentally types their password, or internal tools. If a threat actor has access to the network that nobody ever meant to go outside the network, maybe hard-coded a password in there. So a variety of places you get credentials, sometimes credential reuse. That could be one way that they will gain that initial access to other systems. Exploits, generally for ESXi, what they're used is for initial access and privilege escalation. So a couple of examples of ones used against ESXi in the wild are right there. I want to point out the log4 shell. That seems to be the gift that keeps on giving to the security community. And I also want to point out the CISA note down on the bottom, talking about a couple that have been observed in use by likely an advanced persistent threat. So these are real, and these are kind of interesting to see what people are actually doing out in the wild against these systems. So now that we've gained initial access, there have been a couple backdoors that have been published on. So first, in October 2022, researchers at Juniper published on a very simple Python backdoor that they observed on an ESXi system. So what's pretty interesting about this doesn't have a huge footprint. It's not a giant piece of malware. And what's interesting is that it takes advantage of some of the ESXi inherent behavior. So they talked about how, in order to persist itself, it modified some of the files that, I guess, were on the system, so makes it a little bit harder to sort of detect this. The list of the files is right there. One of the things that they also talked about is it seems like this was particularly designed to victimize ESXi, largely because they talked about the file name, vmtools.py, was particularly evocative of VM tools rather than just kind of a general Unix or Linux backdoor. Spins up a simple web server that can accept and run commands or launch a reverse shell. So there is an example, if you look on the bottom, of what the netcat shell created by this backdoor looks like in the logs. Pretty simple. Seems like they got it from a tutorial. So nothing wildly complex there. So other researchers at Mandiant identified 2 other backdoors in September 2022. And these are more full-featured than the Python one that I just talked about. But one of the interesting things is how they got it to install. So again, taking advantage of some of the ESXi inherent behavior. So what they used is they modified things called VIBs, vSphere installation bundles, and something called an acceptance level. So this is, which things can I install and kind of what level of permissions. So things VMware certified, that's kind of the stricter one, but they modified it to be like, I can install other things. So you can see, for example, what that would look like in the log if you're trying to detect that from the ESX CLI software VIB signature verify there. So particularly interesting. But if you're also kind of looking for that post-exploitation behavior, there are openly available toolkits. One that I want to point out is SharpSphere. So this is very simply a C# implementation of the vSphere Web Services API. And what it allows you to do is authenticate and perform a variety of tasks against these vSphere services. So a couple of examples there, pretty full-featured and exciting. If you combine its use with Mimikatz or WinBag, you can look at the credentials from dump memory. So you can see an example of that in the picture on the right. So now we get to the actual dropping of the ransomware. So talk a little bit about some, I guess, the history of it and some of the kind of interesting features of ESXi ransomware. So ESXi and Linux lockers are not new. So as far back as 2015, the very, very simple and kind of not really super successful Linux.encoder was kind of the first one. And then you sort of start to see a couple here and there in 2019, 2020, and then you start to see some of those kind of bigger names that we're all familiar with if we know a little bit about ransomware. So things like Revil, Conti, Alpha, all start to kind of have their ESXi lockers in 2021, escalates in 2022, and now we're in 2023. So a little bit about how these lockers evolved and some of their trends. So that first one that I mentioned, Linux.encoder, actually had some issues with its encryption key. So a couple of its versions were able to generate encryption keys, but they were predictable. So obviously not super great for business if you're a threat actor looking to get people to pay money, because then they don't need to decrypt your software, so not wildly successful. Then, a couple years later, one of the things that we see is Defray 777, who had a Windows locker at the time. What we saw was they were the first to port their Windows locker to Linux. So now they have these two variants, particularly interesting. Later, kind of shortly after, what we start to see is bigger groups. So DarkSide, and again, Defray 777, come out with an ESXi locker. So I believe that was late 2020, but they were really kind of the first kind of big names, and reputation's pretty important, so that's interesting. But some of the trends, if you look at a lot of these lockers and over time, you'll start to notice that compared with Windows versions of the lockers, the ESXi and Linux versions often have no string encryption or obfuscation or really anything to make it a little harder to reverse engineer compared with their Windows counterparts, even if they do. So a couple of examples there. So Revil had their Sonic malware, but they had their moderately short-lived Revix, their Linux version there. So you can see really no encryption there at all in the second picture. Also, generally they were written, and to some degree still are, in C and C++, but like kind of the general ransomware landscape, we do see actors moving towards both Golang and Rust. And a couple examples there include Alpha, Luna, Nevada, and Hive before they were taken down by the FBI. And then finally, we've heard a lot about leaked code and builders. So the Conti leaks, the Black Matter builder leak, and more recently kind of the Babbook code leak has made it more feasible for kind of new entrants into the market and more people to do badness. So I'll dive into those concepts. So moving to Golang and Rust. So other than being a little bit more challenging to reverse engineer than C and C++, one of the things that this offers the threat actor is cross-compilability. So you can write one set of code, build it, and then you get a Windows, a Linux and ESXi, and sometimes even an ARM locker out of that one set of code. So much easier to maintain that one code base rather than having your separate Linux and your Windows locker and kind of going with that. So I guess DevOps, kind of nice. In terms of Rust, so previously there was a stealer called Ficker Stealer that was written in Rust, but really not a lot of kind of ransomware until Alpha came out with their big Rust locker in late 2021. And what we started to see is other threat actors start to move towards it. So Hive, before they were taken down, originally had a Golang locker, and then one of the things that they did was they transitioned their Golang locker to Rust in early 2022. It's particularly interesting. Though we still see kind of the more traditional languages, I guess you could say. So C, C++, and associated with some of those bigger names here. So BlackBasta, Royal, TrueScript, and Avast Locker are a couple of examples. So you can see what a part of the Alpha Rust locker looks like if you look in the image there. So there you go. So in terms of obfuscation, you may be asking, why don't they obfuscate them? So it's not necessarily super needed compared to Windows. So generally what you'll do is you'll obfuscate the code to make it so that it lands on the system. It evades any AV, automated detection like that. But there's not really as much AV available for ESXi, kind of less needed there. And there's fewer detection tools to evade, so don't really need to do that. I know a lot of people talk about how it makes reverse engineering harder. Yes, it does, but I think most threat actors, most of us know that reverse engineering is going to happen anyway. So not really going to stop them for super long. A couple people have made some sort of attempts at adding obfuscation to their ESXi lockers. So if you look on the top, Hive had some Golang samples circa 2021 that had some relatively simple XOR-based cipher that was used by all of their versions. So you can see there. So additionally, their Windows version as well. Other threat actors, so Alpha made a slightly bigger attempt at obfuscation. They offered this toolkit called ALPHV. It was offered for Windows and Linux and ESXi, promised AV evasion, string encryption, garbage code insertion. That's how they were going to do it. So the Windows one did, in fact, have these features to it, but the Linux and ESXi one did not work as advertised. And one of the particularly interesting things, so generally, the function names are removed, but it looks like almost a C# or a C++ name mangled version of the function names were added back. Don't think that was entirely intentional, but it's particularly interesting to see. So if you look in the bottom image there, that's kind of what that looked like. So to date, the ESXi variant of ALPHV is actually no longer offered, just the Windows one. And I mentioned the problem of code leaks. So Babok's ESXi locker code was leaked on the internet, and a couple of researchers looked into it and a bunch of the other variants. So what they looked at and decided that some actors seem to have borrowed this leaked Babok code. Some that were more direct, similarities definitely looks like more direct borrowing, include something called Mario, Play, Babok 2023, Rorschach, DataF, and several other variants as well. But one of the things that they talked a little bit about is that it looks like maybe there was a common developer, some other kind of code commonalities with some of the other bigger groups, so Conti and Revil. So can't really speak to that necessarily, but it's one of their observations. So as defenders, why this is a problem is that this lowers the barrier to entry even further for an aspiring threat actor. So now you really don't need any technical skill. So you can grab this code off the internet, you can build it, and then you're off to the races to start victimizing ESXi servers, which is not great. Or if you're slightly more enterprising and you want to start adding features, this is a great first starting point. So you can start adding features there, make it more fully functional, suiting your needs. And ultimately to us, this opens the opportunity for more ESXi variants and attacks, which is not great. So now that almost anybody can obtain this code, they can kind of start doing badness at will. And I know attribution is often a question that some threat researchers will ask about. The fact that this code is openly available and really anybody can use it could complicate attribution. So if you want to just go pull it, conduct badness, it's not really linked necessarily to you. If you start adding some kind of features yourself, maybe it becomes more unique, but that's a conversation for a different day. So what do ESXi lockers look like under the hood? So this is not necessarily from one specific one, but sort of an amalgamation of several that I've looked at. And what I wanted to do is highlight some of the commands that they're running under the hood so you can kind of see what that looks like. So one of the first things that they'll do is find and then shut down all the running VMs. So I'm sure you're all familiar with, if you don't necessarily shut down your VM gracefully, you run the risk of corruption, not great for business if they can't decrypt your stuff because they've corrupted it. Then they'll do something like deleting the VM snapshots. So if you're familiar with like deletion of shadow copies, kind of similar, makes it harder to recover. So now you don't have snapshots to revert back to. Then they'll kill off some running processes, so similar to Windows, anything that could interfere with the encryption process. Looking for and deleting any of the attached storage to the host, again, could interfere with encryption. Then they get to the actual encryption of the files, so they will look for files with particular extensions. So again, like Windows, avoiding anything that sort of makes sure the computer can keep operating. So they're again looking for sort of those data files that they can leverage during the extortion process. And then finally, a lot of them will do some sort of cleanup and then drop a ransom note. So cleanup could be deleting logs, self-deletion, anything like that. And oftentimes they'll put the ransom note in random directories and the message of the day. So now that we've kind of talked about all these variety of stages, I'm sure we'll all remember the ESXi's ransomware attacks of February this year. So looking at kind of some of the things that they did at the discovery stage, so it's suspected that they, were looking for ESXi servers pretty indiscriminately with open port 427, so open SLP port. So you could do something like using Shodan, you could use something like Census to start doing this. Then moving to initial access, some researchers talked a little bit about Potentially, they exploited this particular vulnerability. Not entirely sure about that, which was a heap overflow issue in the OpenSLP service. So again, 427, now we gain initial access. So the Python backdoor that they used, so I talked about the one from Juniper, this that created a reverse shell. It was almost nearly identical to that one, so particularly interesting. So I know we talk a lot about, we put things out in open source and we can read them. I guess so can threat actors. Potentially, they got some ideas from there. And then finally, they dropped the ESXi ARGS ransomware. So this was not a super challenging or sophisticated piece of ransomware, and it was a combination of an external shell script that would run a binary that ran ESXCLI commands. So now that we've talked about all these different types of badness, one of the things I want to highlight is detection opportunities. So they're kind of these multifaceted approach in sort of 4 key categories. So first, authentication and authorization. Next, reducing your attack surface, so making sure there's fewer opportunities to escalate the attack for a threat actor. Then software attestation, so making sure only the stuff that's trusted and legitimate is allowed to execute in your environment. And then finally, monitoring and logging, so you can identify your anomalies. So on the authentication and authorization, really kind of the credential access and reuse is a great opportunity. So being able to reduce that, variety of ways here. So I'm not going to belabor the idea of multi-factor authentication for your high-privileged accounts, not implementing Active Directory authentication for your administrators. If people leave, change roles, responsibilities change, making sure you're pruning and auditing the accounts, requiring strong passwords, especially for those high-level accounts. And then monitor any sort of leaked credentials, maybe of the threat intel platform, and require password changes if you identify any. And if you want to do something like alerting, you can look for things like account modifications, any enabling or disabling of services that you don't expect, and then authentication patterns if you want to start to look for that anomalous activity as well. So in order to reduce the attack surface, a couple different opportunities. I know I talked about how patching is something that is difficult, but not only kind of thinking for the ESXi systems, but other parts of your network too, because the threat actor could gain access to that, so looking for opportunities there. Reducing opportunities to move laterally for the threat actor, so maybe they can't even get to your ESXi server. So a lot of this documentation is kind of like from best practices for VMware for securing, but they talk a little bit about some of the ports, and you can restrict access to these ports, limiting any of the services your host can connect to, and then SSH and shell access is a great way for people to gain access to ESXi servers. So if you don't need them, consider disabling them or monitoring them pretty carefully. And if you're into the internal threat hunting exercises, really kind of test your own attack surface. And if you want to try and figure out misconfiguration issues and make sure things are accessible or inaccessible the way that you think they are, and you want to try some proof of concept exploits for targeting ESXi, there are a couple out there. Some openly available C2 frameworks actually have their own, pretty point and click if you're not kind of sophisticated threat hunter yet. And another activity you can try is internal scanning. So who can you see? Should you be able to see them? Should they be able to see you? Great question to start figuring out the answer to. So for software attestation, again, ensuring only the trusted and legitimate software can execute. So things like secure boot can help prevent the bypass of the VIB acceptance level that I mentioned that Mandy had talked about those 2 backdoors being installed with, using TPM 2.0 if you can. Not everybody can, but definitely worth considering. And then enabling something called exec installed only to prevent custom code execution, if that suits your needs. And in terms of the VIB acceptance level, here's a couple of the examples, or here's the 4 examples for what these are. From the most restrictive to the least restrictive, so picking the one that is right for you. And then finally, monitoring and logging. So we talked about Sigma rules, not necessarily being appropriate for the logs of free ESXi. However, you can consider using them on some of your Windows hosts as well. So for example, I talked a little bit about that advanced IP scanner being used from a Windows host to start looking for those ESXi hosts. And you also have some opportunity there for some web server logs. So here's a couple of examples of Sigma rules for those. And looking for those vulnerabilities is there. Monitoring your network traffic too and connection attempts on specific unexpected ports. And then finally, looking for a variety of unusual behavior, which is probably pretty organization specific. So things like snapshot creation, modification, or deletion might be something that you might want to look into. And then if somebody is clearing any logs, resetting the log files, or there's missing timestamps, might suggest that somebody's trying to hide that malicious usage like I talked about earlier. So what is the future of ransomware? It is not going away. Sorry to kind of spoil that. But the cyber criminal landscape will in fact change, as we have seen it do. So again, groups will spin up, spin down, make new tools, modify their tools. It's kind of how it has been. Originally, there was talk about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine might make ransomware kind of go away or be less. We haven't really seen that, unfortunately. And then finally, we'll see probably some extortion techniques evolve. So pretty much if stuff stops working, they want to make money, so they'll come up with new and creative ways to extort victims for money. And finally, it's worth considering not only the fact that these new improved techniques, 0 days, vulnerabilities, things like that, are interesting, but the tried and true techniques will in fact persist. They have persisted and been pretty functional for a long time. So for initial access, again, vulnerabilities and credentials, pretty popular. They will remain popular. Stealers persisted mostly because they work. They're pretty easy to get and deploy. Any of the openly available tools, so Cobalt Strike, very easy to get, open source toolkits, bots and Trojans, and things like Active Directory enumeration, password spreading, lateral movement techniques. And with that, are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for a great presentation. I really enjoyed it, as well as others. Now, we have more than 5 minutes for questions. So we have 3 microphones there. So don't be shy. Go ahead. Yeah, use a microphone. Make a line. We have more time for questions.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation. I have also investigated a bunch of these ESXi's ransomware, and I've noticed there's like both verbose mode, and you can do like --help, and they give a lot of things, indicating that sort of it might not be the same group that develops the ESXi lockers that actually performs the ransomware. Is that something you have observed as well?
So is what you're asking generally, is the group of developers the same people that are actually running it? So if it is a ransomware as a service group, I would say that that is definitely true, right? So a set of developers, the administrators will create the ransomware, and then people who are called affiliates will come, gain access to it, either vouchers, money, whatever. Then they will go off, conduct the attack, and they can be members of multiple groups. So you may see one affiliate who's a member of Alpha and LockBit and a variety of other groups. They will conduct the attack. Then the administrators will get some amount of the profit if they are successful. So yeah, you have software designed by one group of people for use by however many others. And some of the groups have more open affiliate programs than the others, so that's probably what you're saying. Yeah, everybody needs a help menu. That's super helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Lindsay. I have 2 questions others have. The first question, after Golang and Rust, what do you think the criminals will be used after these two? I'm interested in your guess.
Oof. So where they're going to go, I don't know. But I think we'll see. It's unfortunate. I wish I could predict that. I think they will continue using those cross-compilable languages for a while. I think living off the land will always be pretty popular because that's harder to detect. So they'll probably keep doing that. I think we'll see people using open source tooling because a lot of the time it works, not necessarily detectable, and reduces some of the attribution.
Thank you. Another question. One of your slides said not to set the administrator account on the Active Directory, which I think true. But do you have any suggestion how to set up the administrators, how to set up the account for the administrator of AD server?
So no, I think that that's something that is kind of not exactly my specialty, so I don't want to be wrong.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you.
Hello. Just a quick question. You mentioned different types of ransomwares. And if we will take all of them, how much % of them it's possible to decrypt? Just some rough numbers, maybe.
So are you saying that if they encrypt somebody's stuff just for researchers to decrypt them? So if they've implemented the crypto correctly and you don't have the key, you cannot decrypt it. I know there have been some that have made some slight mistakes in the past. So I believe BlackBasta was kind of one of the big ones a couple of years ago at this point, where they had, I guess, rolled their own crypto incorrectly. So I believe researchers at ESXi were able to do that. But I guess modern ransomware, no, I mean, that's how they make money. So they want to do it correctly. So if you don't have the key, you're out of luck.
So it's like almost like 0%? Or?
I would say it's pretty impossible if they've done it right, unfortunately.
I just have one question for you. It's kind of outside the scope maybe a little bit, but what kind of keeps you up at night in terms when it comes to like the future of ransomware and like threat actors and things like that?
So I would say the thing that keeps me up at night is we talk a lot about like the ransomware itself, and I think there's a lot of focus on the specific ransomware. And I know some of the other speakers have talked about this, but like, how do we get kind of the detection even earlier? So can we thwart them at the initial access? Can we thwart them at the post-exploitation? And are we investing enough tools and resources and attention in that? Because I know the ransomware is like, oh, a new one. But what else can we do to kind of move the detection timeline further up, if that makes sense? So what am I missing, if that makes sense?
I believe that I saw you say that they are deleting the storage lens as part of the attack. Why does that make sense for ransomware as opposed to encrypting it, so I'm going to pay to decrypt? Are they not deleting their own work?
So they might have something else to encrypt those, but if they're trying to just get the ESXi itself, so sometimes you'll see people have different lockers for different things. So NAS lockers are a thing, for example. Sometimes you have your Windows ones, but what they're trying to do is kind of encrypt stuff efficiently, quickly as possible. Either they'll encrypt that with something else or something else. It's kind of hard to say, if that makes sense. But
Don't be shy. We still have 3 minutes for question and answer.
okay, well, thank you. Find me after.